Hi, I'm Andy McInnes. I'm a technical instructor for MIT's Integrated Design and Management. You're watching today's video, which is finishing one. And what we're doing in this assignment is to take our wrench-shaped block, which I'm sure you all know well, and know and love so well, and we're going to prepare it for primer. In finishing two, we're going to take the primered, prepared block of Ren and we're going to get it ready for paint. Okay, so we'll start with the Ren-shaped block. Okay, I've got this to a fairly rough shape with a file, and I'm sure you remember this process. We file it down to get it really close, and I'm going to go through a course of different sandpaper grits to get it smooth enough so that we can prime it. The reason I do that, and the reason I don't do it all at once with just one grit of sandpaper, is because the file has left very large scratches on the surface. If we magnify the surface of the part, this is what it would look like. When I use 80 grit sandpaper, I'm going to make smaller grooves and scratches. And each course of sandpaper will make smaller still scratches in the surface, until finally we have a surface that's smooth enough so that when I spray it with the primer, it fills in all of those scratches, and it makes it a lot easier to go and prepare it for paint. So I've glued a block of wrench-shape to the bottom of my wrench-shape block. You could use anything to hot glue on the bottom, because I use this to hold it and also to clamp it. Just makes it easier to work with. So I'm going to start with 80 grit sandpaper. I've cut a strip of 80 grit using a straight edge and a sharp knife. Right? And the way I'm going to fold it is fold it in half once. This is important because this will allow you to get the most out of your sandpaper and have a much better time sanding. You have I'm going to show you that by doing this, you get a stiffer piece of sandpaper with more control, and you can flip it over and use all of the sandpaper for efficiency. Okay. So I'm going to start with the 80 grit, and we're going to start smoothing out the surface that we just did. We just shaped with our files. And sometimes you can't tell if you've got a high spot or not. I like to put pencil marks on there so that I know where I'm sanding, so that I don't run the risk of sanding too much off in one spot. Again, I'm not doing any of the nice sharp details with the 80 because it'll take them right off. And you can see there's a little pencil mark there. That's probably a good sign that that's a low spot. Okay, I've got the block where I like it. It's all a nice smooth surface. Now I'm switching over to 120 grit, and I'm going to continue. Now when I'm using the 120 grit with this material, the wrench-shape, that is, it's a fine enough grit so that I can start to work the corners down. Putting a radius on the corners. Okay. pretty happy with that. Now I'm going to 220, which is a finishing grit. It's when you've reached 220, that means you're approaching paint, and you are probably pretty happy at this point with the shape of your surface overall, because 220 is just going to start really smoothing things out. You can't really shape anything with this, at least not in this material. So 220 again is one of the last steps before we go to primer. With the 220, I've just done a diagonal sanding, so that instead of going this way, where I know all the other scratch marks are, I've tried to do diagonal to help get rid of, and also to see where there might be any major issues that I have to deal with that I couldn't see if all the scratch lines were going in the same direction. Okay, now this is close enough so that we can go and shoot primer. Okay, so when we come back, we'll be in the spray booth. All right, so now we've moved to the spray booth, and another reason why I've got my block up on a little stick like this is because I stand it up, and also because I can hold it while painting it without having to actually hold the part and get my fingers all over the paint. So I'm wearing gloves because this paint might get on me at some point. So I don't want that. I don't want to have to clean it up. So I'll just put the gloves on, and if any paint gets on my hands, it's not a big deal. These are disposable gloves. Once they get dirty, you just throw them away. We have the spray booth here, which means I don't need to wear a respirator for doing small amounts of work, like what we're going to do here. Just put a little bit of spray paint on this. So this will be our first coat of primer. This is where we're going to, once we get it primered, we'll be able to look at it and probably see some mistakes that we didn't see when it's right now before it gets primered. Okay? And we'll go through perhaps multiple coats of primer with sanding in between before we get to a final coat of primer that we really like. Okay? So before I turn on the machine, I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of painting. The machine is very loud, so I can't talk to you while the machine's on. Okay? But I'm going to hold the spray can in one hand and hold the part in the other, and I'm going to take strokes that start on off the part, they pass through the part, and then they stop over here. And I'm going to take nice even strokes, holding it about that far away, okay? And at this point, it's better if you put a little too little on and have to spray it twice than it is to put on too much and have to wait overnight maybe before you can sand it. So this responds very well to a light touch. This valve is not an on-off switch. It actually is a little bit variable, so with some experience you'll be able to use a lighter touch rather than a heavier touch to put less paint on and have a much more controlled paint surface. Okay, so I'm going to turn on the fan, and once I'm done spraying, I'm going to leave the piece in here to dry for about 15 minutes. That's about how long it takes before you can do anything with this paint. And if you've put a really heavy paint on it, you really might have to wait overnight. If you haven't put enough paint on, that's fine. You'll be able to put another coat of paint on in just a few minutes. So I'm going to turn the fan on, and I'll show you how to spray. Okay, so I've painted this. The paint is dry, and what I'm going to do now is I have some 220 and 400 grit sandpaper that I've got ready to go. Where I see places that need more sanding, I'm going to go in with 220. Where I see a nice smooth surface, I'm going to go in with 400 and then prepare to spray paint again. And depending on what my goal is and how good the part is, that will determine how many cycles of sanding and painting I need to do. The paint clogs up the sandpaper fairly quickly when you use very fine paper, so you have to keep changing how you hold the paper. And that looks nice and smooth. So at least that top surface, I think, is pretty much ready for another coat of paint. Okay, so this is now pretty good as far as the primer goes. Okay, I've got my second coat of primer on. What I'm going to do now is take it down with, I'm going to start sanding with 400 grit and see how we look, and then 600 grit. And I think at that point, I'm going to find that this is ready to paint, and I'll hit it with steel wool to take all kinds of scratches out, and then it should be ready for paint. Now here's the steel wool. Okay, this is ready for paint. All right, so I'm spraying my gloss black paint. I'm going to use nice, even, long strokes. Put on just enough paint and not too much. If you don't know where that line is, and most of you won't before you mess it up a few times, just put a little bit less on there and then do it again in 5 minutes. If you get dust or anything stuck in there, just wait until the paint is dry before you attempt to fix it, or you'll really mess things up. There it is, gloss black. Okay, so this is the part, and it's out of the spray booth. It was in there overnight. Overnight is a good general time to have something sit in the spray booth to dry to the point where you can touch it, inspect it, sand it, maybe use it if it's good enough. The actual time, of course, depends a lot on how thick you put the paint on, how humid it is outside, and what kind of paint it is. So for rattle can stuff, it's overnight is a good benchmark to start with. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I can feel that there's little blemishes in the paint, things, maybe dust sticking to it. I can see that it's got some blemishes that were probably in the primer, but I couldn't see in the primer because it's sort of all the same color. And a lot of times you'll get to this first paint coat, and then you'll decide that you want to sand it down and maybe primer it again. The primer is there to promote adhesion between the wrench-shaped part and the paint that you're going to stick to it. But most primers are also there to build up a thickness and allow you to sand them easily. Okay, this being a paint coat and not a primer coat, this is not designed to be easily sanded, although you can sand it. And I'll show you that right now. I'm going to clamp this up in the vise, and I'm going to get my very fine sandpaper. I now have 600 grit sandpaper. If you remember, we're going to take our piece of sandpaper that I've just cut. I'm going to fold it in half, crease it, and then fold it again in half on itself, basically turning it into quarters, right? Now what that gives me is a nice clean piece of sandpaper with 4 individual surfaces and sharp corners, okay? I have a little thing full of water right here. It's just water. I'm going to put some water on here. This water is going to lubricate the paint and the sandpaper, and it's also going to lift up all the little pieces of sandpaper or little pieces of paint that we're sanding off and carry them away so that it won't clog up the sandpaper, okay? And I'm going to keep putting it in the water to make sure that I don't have a dry paper. This paper will work dry as well, but its real value is when you wet sand, because the wet sanding is much closer to polishing, because it removes all the actual paint that you're sanding, and you can see it comes right off in the water. It's actually it prevents the paint from clogging up the paper. It's a wonderful thing. So I'll do the side, and you can see the paint is in the drops of water that are coming off of this. So in this case, it's good that we're on a black floor, because nobody will see the mess I'm making till later. So I'm just sanding to see what my surface looks like. I'm going to take a towel. I'm going to wipe it off. Maybe do a little cleanup here. And take a look at this. This is probably approaching ready for the second coat of paint. I can see scratches in it that were probably in the primer that I painted over, and now they're being exposed because I've taken the paint down to a very thin thickness there, and you can see some of the patterns, some of the blemishes that were in the primer are now showing through in the paint. So I'm going to continue and do the whole thing and get it ready for its you know, the next coat of paint. It might be final, it might not be. Depending on how much quality you want in your paint, you could spend minutes on this, or you could spend days on this, and it's really up to you and up to what your requirements are and what your skill level happens to be. I'm going to just try buffing this out with steel wool as it is right now, and to see if that improves things for me. Not sure it will, but I figured I'd show it to you anyway. It puts a little bit of shine back in the parts of the paint that were dulled by the sandpaper, and I wouldn't need that all the time. But if I'm looking for a really super nice finish, I might try that. So okay, what I'm seeing here, I can see around this edge here, I've got a little bit of unsanded or shiny paint that's on this surface that's right towards the edge. That just means that I didn't get in there enough, and now I can go back in and sand that out, because I can see a ripple in that surface. That's why I'm going after. I want to smooth it out. And as it happens, it looks like I'm sanding right through to the wrench shape. So I have to be very careful with that. Even though this is a very fine grit sandpaper, I can still, in very subtle ways, change the shape of what I'm doing. So we just want to be careful of that. So I will continue on the sides, because I can feel the bits of grit stuck in there. I don't have to go all the way through the paint. If I don't want to, I can stop right there, and this will be a really good base for the next coat of my black paint. So I'll try that again, and it might take several applications to get it to where I'm happy. It might take you one or two, or you might be happy with the very first spray paint application you try. It depends a lot on your skill and what you are looking for. So there's that, and we'll leave it here for now. So you can see, if the camera gets in here, this is set, it's been overnight drying now. This is my second coat of black, and I can see scratches that I'd rather not have in there. Okay, and this is typical, especially a gloss black. This is the hardest color to paint because all your mistakes are visible. Okay, so I'm just going to gently, with the same 600 grit, do the top surface and sand it until I don't see any of those scratch marks again. And I'm going to go and shoot it again with paint. You will do this at least twice to get the finish that you're looking for. Almost nobody gets it right the first time. This side here looks really nice. It's got a mirror finish and very few scratches. I'm going to rotate it around to see if you can see the flash of light in it. The front is good. This side is a little scratched up, so I can go and clean that up as well. Little scratches from the sandpaper. Same with this side. The top really had scratches in it. So depending on what level of finish you're looking for, I'm either just starting, or I'm one spray paint coat away from being done. And it's really up to you and up to your standards of whatever you're doing. So there we have it. Okay, so by this time you spent probably more time than you were hoping to, sanding and priming and sanding and painting and sanding and painting again your wrench-shaped blobs. Okay, I'll recap what we learned so far. That you start with a surface, a wrench shape or whatever material you're using, that's as close as you can get to finished, right? And then you put primer on it, and the primer adds it fills in any of the small scratches that you still have left on your substrate. And when you have sanded the primer and then reprimed it if you need to get it to where you need to where you're happy with it, then the application of paint comes in, and you can you'll then paint it, and you may be done on the first coat of paint. You may decide that you need to sand it again, and that may go on until you are happy with the finish. So the primer is there for adhesion promoting, so that it helps the substrate and the paint bond to each other. It's there to help you sand and make it a nice smooth surface. And the paint is there to give you that color, the hardness, either whether it's a matte finish or a gloss or something in between, or whether you've chosen to put a texture on it. That's what the color's for. Okay, so happy painting.